Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The rain struck my windows in hard, hurried strokes, as if the sky had a grievance with my old carriage house. I kept the lamps low to save the bulbs and watched the glass cloud and clear with every breath of the storm. The little place sits behind a narrow brick home in Ansonbro, a remnant from when horses were the real engines of Charleston. The roof line stoops a little like a tired shoulder, but it has outlasted Gale's renovations and men who talked louder than good sense. I had been alone there long enough to mistake quiet for safety. On the table beside my chair, my phone buzzed one small vibration, then the blinking dot that dares you to care. I expected a missed sale notice from the pharmacy or a reminder I would swipe away and forget. It was a voice message, the thumbnail of a sound wave sent by Adrian. For a second I felt the lift a mother feels even when logic has warned her against it, the reflex of hoping a son has thought of her without being prompted. I tapped play. Adrian's voice came through the tiny speaker with that polished ease he learned somewhere between Duke and his first job, confident, bright as if everything in life were a pitch he had already rehearsed. "She's pitiful," he said, as if discussing a spreadsheet, as if pity were a quantifiable drag on growth. Always clinging. Always inventing ways to make herself needed. There was a pause, and then the soft ascent of a woman I knew without seeing. Celine liked her consonants crisp, even an agreement sounded like a decision. The storm muttered against the eaves as my son continued, his voice a little more relaxed, like a man unused to being contradicted. "Once the refinance goes through, we'll ease her out. I can't afford to have her weighing us down." Weighing us down. The phrasing lodged in me like a bead of glass you can't cough free. Not mother, not teacher, not a widow who learned the late bus routes by heart. A weight, an obstacle to be moved discreetly. I let the message run to silence. The house ticked the old clock over the door, the pipes settling the rain under the guttering, finding the same faithful seam it patters through whenever the wind drives from the east. I stared at the pane nearest the porch. Droplets streaked down in diagonal chains, each one a little silver sentence that ended where the sill began. "Guilty of believing a man you raised can still be the boy you held. Guilty of confusing compliance for peace." After a while, I stood careful with my knees. The closet in my bedroom is barely deeper than my arm, but the suitcase was there, a brown vinyl thing with a reluctant zipper. I set it on the bed and then rested my palms on the lid. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and the last storm that snuck in when I forgot the kitchen window. I had told myself for years that leaving was dramatic, unkind, unmotherly. That evening, the idea felt almost plain, as if I were setting out folding chairs for a school assembly, not heroic, not tragic, merely necessary. Clothes were the first items I reached for and the first ones I hesitated over. I have never owned much that could be called dressy. Teaching keeps you practical. Black trousers you can kneel in, cardigans that don't mind chalk. For 27 years at Burke High, I stayed after final bells to help whoever needed it, biology terms with the stubborn sophomore scholarship essays with seniors whose parents worked nights. When Joel, my husband, died at the paper mill in 1990, I traded nights for any extra shift the district would spare. My boy did homework at the end of my desk, his head drooping sometimes as if the bones behind his ears had turned soft. I learned the click of the custodian's keys and the smell of floor wax as precisely as the periodic table. There are systems to survival. First you repeat them, then you become them. When Adrian got the acceptance at Duke's business school, the letterhead of blue so tidy you could iron it. I cashed out the pension a friend had once called your parachute. I don't know if I believed I could fly by myself anymore, but I believed even then, even exhausted, in what an education might spare him. I told myself it was not a sacrifice so much as a redirection I had been saving for security, and security could take the shape of a son with options. I smiled when I signed. Someone in the bursar's office told me I had neat handwriting. Celine arrived a few years later in a gray suit that fit like a thesis sentence, not a word wasted. She worked in corporate communications, the kind of job that teaches you to salt your language with words like boundaries and alignment. She wasn't unkind. She was professionally pleasant. The first time she glanced around my carriage house, I recognized the calculation I sometimes saw in new administrators walking the halls. What can be improved? What must be replaced? What will be tolerated until budget season? "Would you mind texting before you stop by?" she asked, smiling as if she were offering to carry my bag. "We're trying to get the kids on a schedule." A schedule. We had survived by improvisation. Still, I said yes. A yes is often the easiest way to postpone a fight you are too tired to win. The next rules arrived like notes from a committee. Fewer overnight babysits unless coordinated. No sweets without checking. Please don't move the stroller from the hallway. It disrupts the routine. Adrian echoed them with a gentleness that made refusal feel ungenerous. I tried not to remember the evenings he slept on the linoleum under my desk, a paperback tented over his face to fool the janitor into thinking I'd carried him to the car. Money as ever was the place where tenderness goes to die. I still paid the property tax on the carriage house. There is a pride in keeping current on the bill with your name at the top. But one evening, Adrian lifted a receipt I had left by the sink and frowned as if it contained a riddle. "Mom, you don't need bran cereal. The kids don't care." The box he held was the kind I used to buy when I was the sort of hungry you can tide over with coffee, a little sweetness for him in a week, when mortgage and gas had bullied me into austerity. Back then, buying it felt like love, that didn't require explaining. Standing in my kitchen as a guest in the house I kept, I watched him interpret it as wait. There are translations that cost more than they reveal. That night, this was months before the storm, I opened an old leather notebook Joel's sister had given me the Christmas after he died. The first pages held recipes and the measurements of a linen closet I meant to rebuild. I turned to a blank page and wrote the date. Then I copied numbers, groceries, tax, school fees for the youngest grandchild's aftercare that would be paid back when things settle. I stapled the receipts to the paper with a short brass stapler and drew a neat line beneath the column. If my life was going to be audited, I decided I would keep the books. I don't know whether I intended defense or devotion, but my handwriting steadied. The ledger grew quietly patient as mildew a record not so much of money as of the stubbornness of caretaking. I didn't tell Adrian. I didn't tell anyone. It felt like keeping an extra house key in your pocket on the walk home, a private assurance against a lock that might stick. The storm eased. The lanes along Society Street would be gathering their usual puddles, reflecting gas lamps in little trembling dashes. I returned to the bed and unzipped the suitcase. I folded 2 pairs of trousers and 3 shirts into rectangles the size of courthouse files. Socks tucked into shoes. A photograph dropped from the closet shelf when I reached for the cardigan I saved for church. It was a sun-faded print from Sullivan's Island Adrian at 9, the wind flattening his hair away from his forehead, his hand hooked into the crook of my elbow as if my arm were both railing and landmark. I pressed the picture between 2 pages of the notebook before I knew why I'd moved. Sometimes the body reconciles what the mind argues with. My hands went to the kitchen and came back with the envelope marked tax. I slid it beside the notebook. On the table by the window, the phone lay black and oblong like a piece of the night someone had sanded smooth. I did not replay the message. The words would not grow wiser with a second hearing. I sat again and listened to the drip that lives in my kitchen wall. Houses have habits. So do people. Adrian had learned to speak in bullet points. I had learned to ask less and solve more. Somewhere between those lessons, we had misplaced the third kind of sentence, the one that pauses to admit not knowing. It is a risk telling the truth to your own child. The truth has a way of opening doors you had braced shut. A little after midnight, the wind dropped. The rain grew finer, the kind that becomes a veil over streetlights and makes ordinary things seem rehearsed. I walked to the small secretary desk by the window and lifted the ledger. The leather is cracked in 2 places, like dry riverbeds, and the strap used to be longer. I slid the strap through its loop and carried the book to the bed. The suitcase waited plain as a statement without adjectives. I set the ledger in first. I do not pretend I felt brave. I felt accurate. The difference is not as small as people say. I added a comb and a tin of balm I keep for my hands. I placed the photo where it would not bend. I took the cardigan from its hanger and folded it so the elbows would not crease. Somewhere next door, perhaps the sound of a television filtered through plaster, a laugh track at low volume. The city reshuffled itself into sleep. On the table, the phone glowed for a moment and went dark. I left it where it was. The house creaked and the old clock over the door swung its single promise forward, patient and inevitable. I turned off the lamp and the room became a shape I knew by its lines alone. The suitcase, the chair, the window, the indentation on the pillow, where my hair would warm the cotton and then cool. Near morning, the rain thinned to the faintest brush of sound like a hand testing fabric. I rested my palm on the suitcase lid and closed it. I did not make a speech to the walls or to my better angels. I did not pray for clarity or thunderbolts. I placed the notebook of numbers where it could not be forgotten, and the zipper teeth met with a small obedient rasp. Outside, the alley held its breath. Inside, I took mine. Dawn bled into the alley in one pale stroke, the kind that makes brick look damp and honest. I zipped my coat, lifted the suitcase, and let the door fall closed until the latch answered with its small metal certainty. The habit in my hand reached for the bowl by the frame where a spare key once lived. There was nothing there now. I slid my fingers along the wood anyway, the way you check your pocket for a coin you've already spent, then stepped into the wet morning. Charleston does not hurry at first light. Trucks nose along East Bay like tired cattle, newspapers thump doorsteps. Gulls argue over things they don't want, but won't surrender. I walked to the corner and hailed a cab with the clean guilt of a person who has saved 1,000 times and decided not to save today. The driver asked for a cross street. I named a hotel that overlooks the Ashley, one of those glass and neutral places where carpets have no memory. At the desk, a clerk with a name tag that said, Allie shook off her sleep and found kindness. 2 nights to start, she asked, tapping. I nodded. The word start crowded itself with meanings, and I let none of them out. She slid a key card across as if it were a permission slip. The room had a window that made the river feel nearer than it was, and a bed that swallowed the idea of a body before a body ever touched it. I set the suitcase where I could see it and peeled off my damp coat. The ledger went on the desk. I opened it the way a nurse opens a tray, knowing there will be instruments and that they will not sing. The first thing I wrote was the date. The second was the number of the room. I copied the cab fare and the rate printed on the placard that sternly explained incidentals. The pen made that faint whisper I've trusted for a lifetime. I am not good at asking for help. I am good at asking paper for it. The bank was 4 blocks over. I chose the walk because my body needed to be told it could still carry me places I had not rehearsed. The lobby smelled like lemons and language policy language, the kind that can make anything sound like a courtesy. A young man guided me to a chair and told me someone would be with me in just a moment, which is the longest measurement we have invented. I did not fidget. The ledger sat in my lap, a patient thing, and I rested my palm on it as if it could feel steadier with my skin against its cover. Her name was Nadine. She had a silver streak in her bun and the sort of eyes that listen. I told her exactly what I wanted an account in my name alone. No online linkage, no shared notifications, paper statements to a post office box I would open before lunch. She searched the screen as if the answer might be hiding behind a menu. We can certainly do that, she said at last. Would you like to close your joint account at the same time? I could hear Adrian pronouncing the words joint account years ago, that voice of his already practicing authority, easier for the utilities mom. Easier if something happens. I heard my own old reply, the kind that smooths a wrinkle instead of mending a tear. All right if it helps. No, I told Nadine. Not today. She waited a silence like a comma. I need it to stay as it is for now, I said. I'll redirect what I can. She nodded. Understood. We set passwords that did not pretend to be clever. We signed papers I read down to the commas. When she pressed the notary stamp into the corner of a form, the thunk of it carried a dignity I recognized. Afterward, she stood, then paused. Ms. Cole, she said, lowering her voice, this is none of my business. But if anything about that joint account ever doesn't look right to you, call me directly. My card's inside the folder. I thanked her and meant it. The folder slid into my bag beside the ledger. It struck me that all morning I had been assembling a cardboard city accounts, numbers boxes, on a form that would contain me better than any apology. I ate a cup of soup I couldn't taste and walked toward Broad Street, where lawyers huddle like priests near the cathedral. Years ago at the school holiday party, the vice principal introduced me to a woman from church who did elder law. I had written her name on the back of a raffle ticket and tucked it in the ledger, sure I would never use it. It was there, still tucked beside recipes for lemon bars. Her office was spare in the way some classrooms used to be, plants that minded their business, diplomas with gold seals, a bowl of peppermints that dared you to believe in small mercies. I'm Portia Devlin, she said, standing to shake my hand. We sat. On her desk lay a pen heavy enough to commit a century. I told my story without embroidery. Celine's watchful smiles, the creeping rules, the way a receipt can turn into a trial, the message I ought not to have heard. When I finished, the air between us felt leveled like a field after rain. Do you have any documents in place now? She asked. I handed her the file I had assembled from the kitchen drawer over the years, the old will, the durable power of attorney, the healthcare proxy I had signed when my shoulder went out, and Adrian insisted on being prepared. She read, as a good teacher reads patiently with the attention that treats text like a creature that deserves care. The power of attorney gives him wide latitude, she said, tapping. If your relationship is strained, we'll revoke it, today. She slid a template across, already typing the particulars. We'll also revise your healthcare proxy. I recommend naming someone you trust who is not dependent on your finances or your son's goodwill. She glanced up. And the house is mine, I said, hearing the old boards under those words. A carriage house behind a place on Lawrence. I've kept the taxes current. Good. She folded her hands, not pious, just sure. We can title it into a revocable trust in your name. You remain trustee. You control it while you're well. You'll name a successor. It makes the asset far less convenient for anyone else's plans. She didn't smile at that phrase. She let it stand in the room and point at itself. We worked without dramatics. Paper has its own weather. The revocation of the power of attorney made a crisp sound when the notary's stamp met it. The new healthcare proxy acquired authority as it accumulated signatures. For successor trustee, I wrote to my cousin Eloise Hart, who ran a quilt shop in Walterboro and could do fractions in her head while explaining to a tourist why a handmade thing costs what it costs. Portia dialed while I listened. Eloise answered on the second ring and said my name the way people say it when they have been saying it all their lives. "Do you have it in you to hold a line for me?" I asked when the pleasantries were done. "I do," she said. "Tell me where it is and how thick you want it." We laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because laughter makes rooms sturdier. We looped her into the documents. By the time I stood to leave, a small fortress existed where there had only been a door. On the street, the sun managed a brief showing through gauze. My legs remembered their errands. I steered them back to the hotel and lay down on top of the coverlet without untucking anything. Sleep came like a cautious visitor ready to leave if I made demands. When I woke, the city had slid toward the evening that hour when lights hesitate and then decide to be themselves. A message blinked on my phone from the post office confirming a box number. I wrote it on the inside cover of the ledger, then underlined it. There was one more errand that day, the kind that seems small until you tip it and find history concealed inside. For years on months, when Adrian's plans outran his paychecks, money marched out of my account under the banner of temporary, his word capitalized by tone if not letters. Temporary covers a multitude of returns. At the bank, I sat with Nadine again and asked her to cancel every automatic payment that did not speak my name. The list printed out with an innocence that almost fooled me. We initialed beside each line as if taking attendance. Back at the hotel, I spread photographs on the desk to dry from their long confinement. Adrian at 10 in a Halloween cape I had hemmed with duct tape. Joel in a hat too big for his head, sawing a tree that had no idea it was meant to become a cross for the church Easter pageant. The images made me feel both more and less alone. Every choice we make walks into the room with its relatives. The phone rang with a number I didn't know. It was the bank, but a different voice. "Ms. Cole, this is Antonia from Beneficiary Services." "Nothing's wrong," she said, which is what people say when they are about to tell you something. That is, I wanted to confirm that you did not recently authorize adding anyone to your accounts as a payable on death beneficiary. I sat up straight. "No," I said, "I did not." "Okay." Papers rustled on her end, the kind of pages that wear carbonless copies like petticoats. "We had an inquiry last week from a Ms. Celine Avery regarding your relationship. She asked general questions about survivorship and process. We advised her we could not discuss anything without you present, and that no changes can be made without your explicit written consent." She cleared her throat. "I flagged your file. If anyone calls about beneficiaries again, you'll hear from me first." "Thank you," I said. I wrote the time, her full name, and the gist of our conversation on the next blank line of the ledger. When I hung up, the room changed shape. Not larger or smaller, truer. My jaw ached, and I realized I had been holding it as if my teeth were doors in a storm. I touched my face, and it remembered being softer. There are so many kinds of betrayal that people do not teach you to name. Some are operas. Some are a scraping noise you finally find under the floorboards. I am not a woman of feuds. I am a woman who knows how to inventory a supply closet in under 4 minutes and who understands that the only fair fight is one with rules. I filled my lungs with the even machine-breathed air of the room and let them empty again. Morning began without me, as mornings often do. I stood under the shower until the water cooled into honesty. By 9, I was back at Portia's office signing a deed that took the house I had cleaned and repaired and on lonely nights spoken to and placed it inside a trust with my name. Eloise's name appeared after mine, snug as a second stitch. We added a HIPAA release to the pile, so that if a day arrived when my voice was borrowed or hoarse, June Alvarez, my colleague from the science department, who had shared lunches and griefs and 1,000 staplers with me, could hear what the doctor said and say back what I would have meant. June drove downtown on her planning period and sat in Portia's conference room, wearing a cardigan pillowed with chalk at both cuffs. "You look well," she announced, and then narrowed her eyes as if well were a word she wanted to interrogate. I told her what I needed. She said yes before I finished. When she signed, we both pressed our palms flat on the table as if to hold something steady that the signatures had already steadied. On the way out, I paused at the threshold, the way a person pauses in a pew after a prayer that took more courage than usual. Portia, still standing, said, "We'll record the deed this afternoon. I'll messenger copies to your box and keep originals in our vault. If anyone besides you calls with questions about the trust, I won't be here to answer when they do." It was not a threat. It was the simple arithmetic of her job. I returned to the hotel. The room greeted me with the same impersonal courtesy it had offered the day before. I lay the documents side by side on the bed and walked the length of the room 3 times the way you walk a hall outside an operating room. The ledger waited on the desk, claiming its square of light. Around lunch, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Eloise. "Got a call from your lawyer," she said. I read what I needed to sign, what I needed to. "We're in business, cuz." Her drawl widened at the end and made cousin sound like the original currency. We spoke of ordinary things for a full minute to rinse our mouths of the extraordinary. When we hung up, I pressed the phone to my breastbone for a breath without understanding the ritual. The body invents new religions when the old ones prove too narrow. I ate a sandwich in 2 distracted halves and then took the papers to the post office to send copies to the box. The clerk behind the window admired my snail's pace and did not rush me. A child in line behind me dimpled like a plot point and announced that her mother was buying stamps with frogs on them. I bought a sheet of magnolias and put them between the pages of the ledger as if beauty could serve as a bookmark for resolve. The afternoon thinned into a long corridor of quiet. At school, this is when we used to open windows a crack to let the heat escape and pretend we weren't counting minutes to the final bell. In the hotel, there was no bell and no need to pretend. I ironed a blouse with the tiny travel iron that lives in my suitcase because I have never trusted other people's definitions of crisp. I checked the peephole twice, though I had asked for a room far from the elevator. I dialed June, then hung up before it rang because there was nothing to ask that could be answered. It was the ledger that kept me civilized. I turned pages and added the receipts from the morning. I stapled confirmation slips over the blank space where anxiety would have written its own fictions. The book's spine creaked once a permission. I read backward for a while the way some people pray grocery tax fee. There was an odd comfort in realizing how little of my life had ever been extravagant. The phone lit again with an unfamiliar number. I considered letting it fade. Then I thought about Nadine's card in my folder and Antonia's caution, and the way trust is sometimes a door you set ajar to see if the hinges still listen. I answered, "Miriam." The voice was lower than I remembered, as if it had been teaching itself to whisper. "It's Celine." I did not say her name back to her. Naming is a kind of welcome. Silence is a kind of fence. She cleared her throat. "Please don't hang up." "I'm here," I said. I didn't understand some things she began in the present tense cracked. I believed things I should have questioned. In the pause, I could hear a street through her window, distant brakes, a horn that didn't mean anger so much as impatience. "Adrian told me you were—" She stopped. "That you were always asking for help with bills you didn't need help with. He said you spent on small luxuries and then leaned on him to cover the boring parts. He made it sound calculated." I looked at the ledger lying open on the desk and thought about the way light makes columns look like the backs of soldiers. "And you?" I asked. I repeated what I was told she said. I set rules because rules felt like clarity. I thought boundaries would prevent confusion. She laughed without cheer, as if a boundary drawn by the wrong person could do anything but erase someone else. The river through my window wore the same indifferent gray it had worn in the morning. "Why are you calling me Celine?" I asked. "Because I saw the tax receipt." She said the words coming faster now, as if truth travels only at one speed when it finally gets a lane. "For the house. In April. Your check." "He told me he paid it. He said he kept the roof over your head. I didn't say anything then, but—" The but carried freight and I let it dock. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she added. "I wanted you to hear me say I was wrong. If you want proof of anything he said or done, I might be able to help." I did not fill the silence. It is a skill I earned grading essays that tangled themselves trying to avoid a simple point. My mouth made the shape of the sentence only when I understood what it cost. "Seeing is not the same as changing," I said. "I know," she answered, "but I am seeing." There was another pause, shorter, less performative. "That's all." "Thank you for the call," I said. I meant it. Gratitude and caution can live in the same sentence without fighting. We ended the call without ceremony. The screen returned to its reflection of my face, which looked both older and less prone to grading itself. I wrote Celine's number on a fresh line in the ledger and closed the cover. The room returned to its ordinary corners, the bed, the chair, the window square of sky. Outside, a container ship inched along stacked with the modest audacity of commerce. I set the ledger beside the folder of legal papers and rested my hand on both one over the other, the way a person checks a heartbeat not because she doubts it exists, but because remembering the rhythm makes breathing a line. When the knock came at a neighboring door and a laugh bled down the hall, I did not startle. The clock on the nightstand winked its digital approval of the hour. I turned off the lamp and the dark knew my name. Morning pressed against the hotel glass in a pale sheet. I sat at the desk with the ledger open and a cup of coffee cooling toward honesty. The room had the particular quiet of buildings meant for passing through carpets that swallow footsteps, curtains that forget faces. I wrote the date in the margin and underlined it once. Adrian's text arrived first, no greeting, no embellishment. Noon, King Street, Harker's Cafe. A second message followed as if to keep the first from softening. Bring everything we need to sign. I stared at the words until their edges dulled. The phone set itself back down on the desk as if it knew its place. I called June. Say where and I'll meet you, she said, chalk dust audible in the smile I could hear. King Street at noon, I answered. I'd like you to sit with me. Of course, she said. I'll be the one with 3 pens. I dressed in the blouse I had ironed the day before, the one with a collar like a promise. The folder from Portia's office slid into my bag beside the ledger. I slipped my phone into a zip pocket, opened the voice memo app, and tested the microphone once. The little red bar moved as if it were breathing. I turned it off. I didn't need to seduce myself with rehearsals. Harker's sits between a barber and a store that sells shoes for people who take their feet seriously. At noon, it was busy enough to make privacy believable. The glass door chimed when I stepped in. The air smelled of espresso and cloves, the cinnamon habit of a place that wants to remind you warmth exists. I chose a table near the window, 2 chairs facing the room and one facing me. When June arrived, she set a crossword on the table and pretended to read the clues. You look steady, she said, then lower, and you look like yourself. That will have to be enough, I answered and meant it. Adrian came in like a man who believes doors volunteer to open. Celine followed a step behind her, hand curled around her bag strap the way you hold a rail on a moving bus. My son's eyes did a quick scan, table faces, exits, and then he sat without waiting to be invited. He didn't take off his coat. We don't have long, he said as if time were an employee he supervised. Let's resolve this. He picked up the menu and set it down unread, a habit I remembered from the years when money made him brave. Celine offered a small strained smile, the kind people practice in bathroom mirrors when they want to look like themselves without giving anything away. Coffee, I asked. The waitress appeared with the question already in her hand. Adrian shook his head. Celine said yes, and then seemed surprised that she had. You brought the house papers, Adrian said. The ones you— he caught himself and smoothed his tone until it lay flat. The ones you signed when you were upset? I brought my papers, I said. I took the folder from my bag and placed it on the table, not moving it toward him. He reached. I kept my hand on the cover. We will read them together, I added. The possessive sat there, a small guard dog in an oversized yard. June lifted her cup to her lips and examined nothing in particular over the rim. Adrian laced his fingers together, the lecture posture he uses when he wants to look judicious. I realize you've been under strain. We all have. But the refinance is in motion. The carriage house was part of the package we discussed. Without your signature to confirm transfer temporary, obviously the numbers don't balance. Celine flinched at the word transfer. Some words carry their own weather. I never discussed transferring my house, I said, calm, so as not to confuse volume with conviction. I discussed paying my taxes and keeping the roof in repair. He smiled the way men do when they want to remind you they used to win arguments by being charming. Mom, let's not parse. We need you to be flexible. You've always said you want what's best for the family. He said family the way bankers say community when they mean liquidity. I slid the folder open. The notary seals winked like small planets. I let him see the thickness of what he was facing. This, I said, tapping the top document, revokes the power of attorney you had. This appoints a different healthcare agent. This places the house into a trust with me as trustee. I loosened my fingers so he could lift the trust, and he did, scanning the first page with the impatience of someone who believes paper exists to acknowledge him. You can't be serious, he said low. You are not in a position to make complicated legal decisions on a whim. I'm not whimsical, I answered. I'm methodical. The tone came out like a teacher lighting a Bunsen burner and waiting for the right flame. The waitress returned with Celine's coffee. The cup clicked against the saucer. Adrian pushed the folder back, not gentle, so that one corner folded. The folded corner felt like a diagnosis. He leaned in. Here's what's going to happen, he said, voice clipped clean. You'll rescind whatever this is and sign the authorization for me to manage the asset side, including the house, until the refinance closes. After that, we can reevaluate. No one is trying to hurt you. But you cannot keep making random purchases and then expect me to cover the boring bills. It's not tenable. June set her cup down. Her eyes met mine, no signal, just witness. Celine's fingers tightened on her spoon until the metal complained. Random, I repeated, not as a question. I reached into my bag, lifted the ledger, and placed it on the table. Adrian's mouth twitched, recognition and irritation sharing a boundary. I opened to the spring and turned the book so it faced him. Receipts stapled in tidy rows. Dates. Notations in a hand as distinct as mine. This is the random that buys property tax stamps and children's aftercare. This is the random that keeps the lights on and repairs the rotten sill we kept postponing because you found a better interest rate for your ambitions. He looked down and then up the way gamblers do when they think the table is mocking them. You see, he said to Celine, aiming for comedy and tripping. Always performing, always curating a narrative. The word performing fluttered in my chest and then lay still. I do curate, I thought. We all do. Some of us curate truth. We can argue semantics, he continued louder now. Or you can act like an adult and stop making this adversarial. Lower your voice, Celine said before she could help herself. Don't tell me how to talk to my own mother, he snapped, then turned the blade. And don't pretend you're innocent in this. You wanted her boundaries as much as I did. People at the neighboring table looked up and then guiltily down. The waitress froze near the counter with a tray like a shield. Outside, a bus sighed at the stop and then gathered itself to move. I set my hand on the folder again, steady as if it contained water we could not afford to spill. Adrian, I said, keeping my voice at the level you use when you explain procedures to 30 students and want them to feel capable of following them. I will not authorize you to use my house as a collateral. I have already transferred it to a trust I control. The papers are filed, the deed is signed, and the authority you held has been revoked. You do not have access to my accounts beyond what they have already provided, and that will change in due course. The last sentence was a bridge I did not name. He blinked, the reality gathering itself too quickly to filter. Then he laughed, a sharp thing that tried to sound generous and failed. You're pathetic, he said, not aware of what he was borrowing from himself. He gestured at the ledger. You're desperate to prove you matter. June inhaled. Celine's eyes closed for a second and opened again with a film of water that did not fall. I said and felt the truth move into the chair beside me. But not to you. He slapped the table. Cups trembled. Spoons chimed. Do you know how this makes me look? Do you understand that there are people relying on me to close a deal and you are making me seem like I can't even manage my mother? I did not remove my hand. The recorder in my bag did its small, faithful work. You've never been good at seeing a bigger picture, he added louder, eyes shifting to the audience he had unwillingly gathered. You're always inserting yourself where you don't belong and calling it care. It embarrasses me. The word embarrasses landed like a stray nail on the floor. Someone would step on it later and bleed. From the corner of my eye, I watched Celine put her spoon down. Her voice found a register that did not ask permission. Adrian, she said, stop. He wheeled on her. You don't get to stop, she repeated without heat. She looked at me, not at my hands, not at the ledger, but at my face. I came because you asked me to, she told him, and every syllable was an object set carefully on a shelf. And because I needed to see how you would talk to her in public. She turned back to me. I'm sorry, she said, and the apology wore no perfume. Adrian flushed. Anger makes some people taller and some people merely red. I won't be manipulated, he said. Not by you. He nodded at Celine and not by... He left the noun off as if the unsaid might seem polite. He stood so quickly the chair scraped like a reprimand. The door chimed a protest when he shoved it open. Street noise rushed in and then sealed behind him. Celine remained seated, hands quiet in her lap. The room exhaled. The waitress approached as if returning to a classroom after a drill. Can I? She began and then set down a glass of water with a lemon slice because sometimes the body needs instructions it already understands. She drifted away without collecting an order. Celine reached into her bag and placed a folded paper beside the ledger. She did not touch it again. He emailed this to a colleague, she said. By mistake. He meant to send it to a lender. He was venting. It references your house as soft collateral and lists a timeline. Her voice stayed neutral in the way a level stays neutral bubble centered despite gravity. I made a copy. Do with it what you decide. I looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. The act of not reaching became its own kind of reaching. June's pen lay on the table, blue ink still damp where she had written the date in the corner of a napkin. Thank you, I said. Celine nodded. She did not ask for absolution. She slid her hands under the table as if to warm them from the room's conditioned chill. For a moment we sat without the burden of speaking. Outside, a man chained a bicycle to a meter and then stood looking at the sky as if he had just remembered he was under it. June cleared her throat softly, a cue, a kindness. I placed the ledger and the paper back in my bag, then closed the folder and pressed my palm briefly against its cover. We stood. Celine stood too. I'll pay, she said. It wasn't a penance, it was a practical sentence. We've had our coffee, I answered. We can settle our own side. She nodded again. The muscles in her jaw worked once like a swimmer preparing to breathe and then relaxed. On the sidewalk, the sun was doing its best imitation of warmth. King Street's traffic hummed a line of ordinary lives arranged nose to tail. June and I walked slowly as if we had just come out of a museum and the regular world needed to be introduced in increments. A breath of salt threaded the air from the harbor. Someone's radio chattered 3 storefronts away. At the corner, June touched my arm. You held, she said. It wasn't praise, it was a measurement. So did you, I said. We waited for the light to change. A bus sighed to a stop and opened its doors with a sound like a curtain. We didn't board. We just stood there long enough to feel our hearts select their pace. Back at the hotel, the room remembered me. I set the bag on the bed, removed the ledger first, then the folder, and placed them side by side. The paper Celine had given me lay between them like a bridge laid across a span that had once been water and was now a fact. I sat on the edge of the mattress and smoothed the coverlet with my palm until the fabric agreed to lie flat. Part 4. English 800 words. Back in the room, I set the bag on the bed and took out the folder, the ledger, and the single sheet Celine had left, the one that named my house soft collateral and itemized a timetable as if a roof were a line item that could be rearranged by charm. I smoothed the paper once and slid it beside the trust. The air conditioner stitched its steady seam through the quiet. Portia read everything before noon. Her office had the same firm light it always did, a personality that refused to be theatrical. I placed my phone on the desk and let the cafe recording spill its neat, ugly minutes into the room. She didn't interrupt. When the last clink of cups faded, she drew the papers into order. We'll send notices today, she said. No contact regarding the property. If he steps foot inside, we'll have the record to match the letter. I'll also copy the lender named here and advise that you have no intention of encumbering the trust asset. She lifted the email. This helps. She stamped, she signed, she slid envelopes to her assistant with the benign gravity of a nurse passing instruments. I initialed where she pointed not as a passenger but as a pilot who understands the switches. At the bank, Nadine met me with her card already in her hand. We've placed an alert on the joint account, she said. Any movement above a small threshold pings me first. If you want to limit it further, we can. We set numbers without ceremony. She printed a sheet of the automatic payments we'd already canceled and drew a line through the last two with the quick satisfaction of a teacher finishing a stack of quizzes. Late afternoon, Antonia from Beneficiary Services called. He tried to add someone to the payable on death this morning, she said. The system blocked the request and flagged it. She paused. You're protected for now. The ledger accepted my notes with its usual patience, time, name, action. I mailed small packets to the people who had watched Adrian grow. The aunt who made his Halloween cape from an old skirt my brother in Beaufort, who lets the phone ring long enough to rehearse kindness before he answers. Inside each envelope, I placed copies of the tax receipt, the summary statement from the bank, and 3 pages from the ledger that added up to a life tended without applause. No letter. Records can stand without narration. Evening opened its hands. I stood by the window and watched a barge shoulder up river containers stacked like intentions. A knock on the door startled me only because it came at a human height. For days, everything had arrived as a notice or a call. June leaned in when I opened holding a paper sack. Chicken and okra, she announced. Food makes paperwork less sharp. We ate at the desk. She didn't ask me how I felt. She asked me whether the trust was recorded and whether Portia had added the HIPAA release we'd discussed. When I nodded, she relaxed the way a person does when a student finally shows their work instead of guessing. Before she left, she set a small potted rosemary on the sill. For the next kitchen, she said, wherever it sits. The next morning, Portia slid a new draft across my will rewritten, so it matched the life on my desk. We listed small bequests the way you list ingredients you have learned matter more than the recipe. My mother's ring to Nora, the eldest granddaughter who mends things without remark. Joel's pocket knife to Max, who cannot pass a rope without wanting to make it better. 3 framed photographs to June. For the rest, we kept the language clean. The trust would remain where it was. Upon my death, the house would pass from my hands to Eloise's hands, and through them into a fund we named plainly the Low Country Safety and Shelter Fund, to be used for people who needed doors that locked and a room that did not require permission to enter. I signed without a tremor I had not earned. The notary's seal bit down with that same satisfying certainty. Portia gathered the papers with the movements of a person who knows a day's work when she sees it. 2 days later, a letter from the lender arrived at my post office box, addressed to me by the name I had always used when choosing to be formal. It confirmed receipt of counsel's notice and stated that no asset under my control would be considered in any refinance unless my signature appeared in a form their office recognized. The sentence was as dry as toast. It tasted like water when you're thirsty? Adrian texted once. You didn't have to escalate. I did not answer. The ledger does not accept replies, only entries. Later that afternoon, Celine sent a single email forwarding a thread that made plain what Antonia had warned me of before it happened. At the bottom, she wrote only, I am sorry for my part. I filed it with the same respect I gave to receipts. When the paperwork was finished, there was still the business of leaving one room for another. I found a small apartment north of Calhoun Street with windows that looked toward a scrap of marsh. The lease was plain. The paint was new. I carried the first box up the stairs myself, because I have always liked the sound of a key testing a lock for the first time. Eloise drove down on a Thursday with 2 quilts folded like maps and stayed long enough to lean her shoulder into mine while we decided where a chair should go. I grew herbs and pots on the narrow balcony rosemary from June thyme and mint that minded their own business. I kept the ledger on a shelf in the living room, not hidden, not displayed, just present. Some evenings I read 3 lines as if they were a poem that only needed to be witnessed to be complete. A week after I moved, Portia called to say the certified notices had been delivered and signed for. 2 days after that, Nadine left a brief message, no unusual activity. The city continued its ordinary thunder of tasks. I bought towels and a kettle. I learned the particular click of this apartment's door and the way the floor warmed where the afternoon light found it. On a Sunday morning, I walked to the Battery and stood with the tourists and the runners, all of us giving the harbor our separate attentions. Wind licked at the water until it showed its small white teeth. A child pointed at a pelican as if she were discovering new physics. My phone stayed quiet in my pocket. When I returned home, I hung my key on a hook by the door that held only that one item. For a long while, I watched it learn its place. I didn't put away the suitcase. I didn't need to. It stood emptied in the bedroom like an instrument between songs not banished, not beloved. I closed the ledger one night and felt its weight shift from tool to record. The rosemary on the sill reached toward the glass. I turned the pot so it wouldn't grow lopsided. The room held me without argument. I opened the window an inch to let the salt find its way in, then sat at the table with nothing left to sign. The air moved around the simple proof of my name on deeds and pages. I let my hand rest first on the table, then on my chest, until my breathing matched the easy pace the day had chosen. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.